All right, let's start. Welcome to our book presentation with Søren Mau, organized by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung Schleswig-Holstein. I am Sebastian and I'm a board member of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. And today I'm very glad that we are dealing with Søren's book, Mute Compulsion, a Marxist theory of the economic power of capital. And the book is based on his PhD. And the book is also a really rare occasion because it was published at first in German at the Dietz Verlag in Berlin under the title Stummer Zwang, eine kapitalistische Theorie marxistischer kapitalistischer Macht. The Danish version followed in 2021, and the English version will appear in, I think, November 2022 at Verso Books in London. And it's really, I think, for me, it's really remarkable that a Marxist book, not written in the German language, still appeared at first in the German language, and I think it's a very good opportunity for a truly international discussion. And please excuse my bad English pronunciation and my bad English language because I don't speak it very often, unfortunately. Now some words about Søren. He studied philosophy at Aarhus University, where he did his bachelor and his master. And his PhD he made in 2019, also in philosophy at the University of Southern Denmark. He works as a critique and freelance journalist at the Dark-Blooded Information since 2015, and since 2020 he's an international book fellow at Goldsmiths University of London and at the University of Copenhagen, and he is right now working on Marx and Body. And besides, he's teaching philosophy, and he belongs to the editorial board of the journal of the British journal Historical Materialism, and he is also of the Danish Society for Marxist Studies. He will now present his main thesis, and when he's finished, we will have enough time for questions and discussions. So thank you very much that you're here, Søren. Thank you very much for all the opportunity to talk about this book in English. So you have the word. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you to you, Sebastian, and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung in Schleswig-Holstein for giving me this opportunity to present my book. And I'm very sorry that I'm not able to do this in German. I would have loved to be able to do so. So in the course of the next 40 minutes, I will do my best to summarize the most important ideas and arguments in my book. And let me begin with the title of the book, Mute Compulsion, or in German, Stummer Zwang, which is an expression taken from, as some of you maybe know, from a passage in the first volume of Capital. In the English Penguin edition of Capital, it's translated as silent compulsion, and in older versions of older English translations of Capital, it's sometimes translated as dull compulsion. But I think that mute is a more accurate translation of the German word Stumme. Marx only uses this expression once in his writings, so it's not like this is a keyword or a central concept or expression for him. Nevertheless, I think that it expresses an idea which can be found in many of Marx's writings and which has not been given the attention that it deserves, namely that the capitalist mode of production relies on an anonymous, abstract and impersonal form of power, or what Marx calls the mute compulsion of economic relations. If you are familiar with Marx's critique of political economy and with trends in Marxist theory in the last couple of decades, you will know that this is far from a controversial or an original idea. Marx is very clear about this, and his descriptions of the impersonal and abstract power of capital are well known. And there are also lots of Marxist scholars who have emphasized this and written about this. For example, Michael Heinrich, Moshe Postone, Ingo Elbe, Robert Kurz, Ellen Meixens-Wood, William Clare Roberts, Andreas Malm, just to give some examples. And I discuss the work of these thinkers, and I draw on them a lot in my book. So I don't claim to have discovered anything new about Marx's writings or about capitalism. However, despite the very common acknowledgement of the existence of this economic power, I think that there was still a need for a systematic theory of mute compulsion, for an attempt to define this form of power and distinguish it from other forms of power, and provide a comprehensive description of its mechanisms on a high level of abstraction. And this is what I try to do in the book. So the book presents a theory, a set of concepts developed on a level of abstraction where we're only concerned with what Marx calls the ideal cross-section of capitalism. So only what belongs to the essence of capitalism, regardless of its historical and geographical variations. And I developed this theory by means of a systematic and critical reconstruction of Marx's thoughts on power, drawing on most of his writings and combining it with insights from all kinds of Marxist and non-Marxist research. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is called Conditions and examines the concepts of power and capital, as well as the ontological conditions of possibility for economic power. So this part of the book asks, how is it possible for human beings to entangle their own life in something like economic power? And answering this question presupposes an analysis of human nature and the specifically human relationship to the rest of nature. The second part of the book is called Relations and examines one of the 2 main sources of economic power, the relations of production. First, I examine the specifically capitalist form of class domination and why this results in an anonymous and abstract form of domination. And then I go on to discuss how the power of capital relies on and reproduces oppression based on gender and racialization. Finally, I discuss the horizontal relations between the units of production, in other words, market relations, and the most important concepts here are value and competition. The third and final part of the book is called Dynamics and examines the second main source of the economic power of capital, the dynamics, which are at the same time a result of capitalist relations of production and a cause of these very same relations. I'll go more into details about this later. And these dynamics include real subsumption of labor and nature and the creation of relative surplus populations and crises. In this part of the book, in the third part of the book, I also examine 2 examples of capitalist dynamics which have greatly strengthened the economic power of capital throughout the course of the 20th century. First, the logistics revolution in the last 50 years, and second, the industrialization, globalization, and rationalization of agriculture in the second half of the 20th century. In a certain sense, my book is an attempt to contribute to answering the question of why capitalism still exists. I think that our epoch is an epoch of economic crisis, of political crisis, climate crisis, unrest, uprising, pandemics, and so on. So despite an extremely turbulent decade, capital has somehow managed not only to hold on to its power, but to expand and fortify it. So we live in an era of capitalist expansion amidst crisis and unrest. And how is that even possible? Why hasn't capitalism collapsed yet? And how do we account for the power of capital? Most attempts to do so rely implicitly or explicitly on the assumption that power assumes two fundamental forms, violence and ideology, or in other versions of this common pair, coercion and consent, dominance and hegemony, repression and discourse. And the reproduction of capitalism is accordingly understood as the result of a combination of the ability of the ruling classes to employ violence and their ability to shape the way in which we consciously or unconsciously perceive and understand ourselves and our world, with varying views on the exact relationship and relative importance of these two fundamental forms of power. And I think that capitalism is certainly unthinkable without the constant presence of violence and ideology. But I also think that there is more to the power of capital than that. And I think that mute compulsion or economic power is a third form of power which cannot be reduced to neither ideology nor violence. On its most fundamental level, power as such is an ability to make people do certain things. For example, to make them sell their labor power or perform surplus labor. The power of capital thus refers to capital's ability to impose its logic on social life. The exercise of this capacity can take on different forms, and one of these forms is violence, which is a form of power rooted in the capacity to inflict pain and death on its targets, on the bodies of its targets. Most people generally prefer to avoid pain, injury, and death, and for that reason, violence or the threat of violence is an effective motivating force. Ideology, on the other hand, is a form of power which is rooted in the capacity to affect the ways in which people, consciously or unconsciously, understand themselves and the world they inhabit, and what they take to be just and unjust, necessary and contingent, natural and artificial, divine and human, inevitable and changeable, and so on. And I think that such ideas and intuition function as coordinates for action, and for this reason, it's also an important source of power. So violence and ideology both address the subject directly, either by immediately forcing bodies to do certain things or by shaping the way in which these bodies think. Economic power, on the other hand, addresses the subject only indirectly by remolding its social and material environment in a manner that forces it to act in accordance with the logic of valorization. So economic power, or mute compulsion, is a form of power which is rooted in the ability to reconfigure the material conditions of social reproduction. And the concept of social reproduction refers here to all the processes and activities needed in order to secure the continuous existence of social life. So economic power is a concept designed to capture how social logics reproduce themselves by being inscribed in the environment of those who are subjected to it. Okay. So let me try to say something about class domination in capitalism. Capitalist production presupposes the ability, the availability of labor power as a commodity, which in turn presupposes that a sufficiently large part of the workforce is denied access to the conditions of social reproduction outside of the market. So in other words, capitalism necessarily relies on class domination, or more specifically, on the creation and the reproduction of a class of proletarians who are forced to perform surplus labor for those who control the conditions of social reproduction. And one of the specific characteristics of capitalist class domination is that it's based on, and this is a quote from Marx, the complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions for the realization of their labor, end of quote. In pre-capitalist modes of production, by contrast, class hierarchies and exploitation were based on the unity of producers and the means of production. In modes of production based on slavery, the producer and the means of production were unified in the sense that both were the property of the slave owner. The power of feudal lords was likewise based on the unity of peasants and their means of production. For this reason, the threat of direct physical coercion was necessary in order to make peasants perform surplus labor. So in contrast to these pre-capitalist modes of domination, the power of the capitalist class is based on the permanent separation of the producers from the means of production and subsistence, as well as from each other, with the consequence that the ruling class can force workers to perform surplus labor without having to employ violence. Instead, they can simply deny them access to the means of their survival. And this is the distinctive economic aspect of capitalist class domination. The valorization of value inserts itself as a mediator in the human metabolism with the rest of nature, whereby workers are driven by their own needs to subject themselves to the demands of capital. And it's important to note that this class domination is not just a relationship between workers and capitalists. It might very well be that capital is first and foremost concerned with securing a steady supply of exploitable labor power, but I think it's really important theoretically and politically to grasp how this relationship of exploitation between workers and capitalists presupposes a wider and much more encompassing form of class domination. In order to force those needed by capitalists as wage laborers to sell their labor power, it's not sufficient to proletarianize only that particular group of people. Capital also has to make sure that everyone who could potentially support and provide means of subsistence for them are proletarianized, that is, cut off from immediate access to the conditions of their reproduction. And what is even more important, given that certain tasks connected with the reproduction of labor power cannot be immediately integrated into the circuits of capital, but are at the same time absolutely necessary for capitalist production, capital also has to make sure that someone is forced to perform this labor. In other words, capitalism presupposes not only the proletarianization of those needed as wage laborers, but of virtually everyone who does not belong to or live off the ruling classes. Capital needs proletarians who offer up their labor power for sale, but it equally needs proletarians who perform the necessary reproductive labor, such as childbirth, childcare, cooking, cleaning, and so on, outside of the wage relation. That is, proletarians whose dependence on capital is mediated by their dependence on other proletarians. And as many Marxist feminists have demonstrated, this uniquely capitalist split between the production of commodities and the reproduction of labor power is the material basis of the oppression of women under capitalism. Another unique feature of capitalist class domination is its impersonal nature in contrast to the personal relations of dependence characteristic of pre-capitalist modes of production. Proletarians are tied to capital as such, and not to a particular capitalist. And this is the result of the specifically capitalist relationship between units of production. So the horizontal relationships in contrast to the vertical class relationships. And the horizontal relationship between the units of production is the starting point of Marx's critique of political economy. In his theory of value, Marx demonstrates that the peculiar unity of social and private labor in capitalism transforms social relations among producers into a quasi-autonomous system of real abstraction, which imposes themselves on everyone. So when social relations among producers are mediated by exchange of products as commodities, their access to their condition of existence is mediated by a market system in which the circulation of commodities generate compulsory standards and demands that these producers must meet in order to survive. And this reading of the theory of value as a theory of abstract social domination is particularly well developed in the work of value form theorists such as Heinrich Elbe, Postone, and Kurz. Scholars in this tradition often downplay the significance of class domination in favor of an emphasis on what Adorno called, and I quote, the universal domination of mankind by exchange value, end of quote. So for these thinkers, the domination of proletarians by capitalists is a derived or a secondary form of a more fundamental domination of everyone by value. And I think that while it's important to recognize the class transcending nature of the power of value, and this is one of the reasons why we should avoid reducing the power of capital to the power of the capitalists, it's equally essential to understand the intimate connection between value and class. As Marx demonstrates in his dialectical analysis of the necessary relationship between value, money, capital, and the commodification of labor power, value actually presupposes class domination. As he puts it in Capital, and I quote, "Only where wage labor is its basis does commodity production impose itself on society as a whole," end of quote. In other words, the universal domination of everyone by the value form can only exist on the basis of the domination of proletarians by capitalists. This does not mean, however, that the horizontal relationships among producers can be reduced to a result of the vertical class relations. The latter is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the former, or put differently, the separation between the producers and the means of production does not in itself make it necessary that social production is coordinated by means of exchange of products of labor as commodities. So for this reason, we have to understand the horizontal and the vertical relations as two sets of distinct yet interrelated relations of dominations, which are both equally essential to the capitalist mode of production. So in order to fully understand how capital reproduces its grip on social reproduction, how it holds on to its power, we need to be attentive to how these two dimensions mediate each other. So proletarians are subjected to capitalists by means of proletarians are subjected to capitalist class domination by means of mechanisms of domination which simultaneously subject everyone to the imperatives of capital. And this is what gives capitalist class domination its distinctively impersonal character. But there's more to the horizontal relation than what the analysis of value uncovers. The dialectical progression of categories in capital reveal that what initially appear as simply as private and independent producers are in fact capitalist companies exploiting wage labor. And on the basis of this insight, it's possible to re-examine the horizontal relations on a lower level of abstraction, where they appear as competition. And competition is an intra-class relation, or to be more precise, it's a relationship between sellers regardless of what kind of commodity they're selling. It could be labor power, for example. And by competing, capitals or workers set in motion a set of universalizing mechanisms which generate social averages, wage levels, for example, that individual capitals or workers are forced to live up to. So the market acts as a transmitter, not of information, but of commands. Competition executes the inner laws of capital, as Marx puts it, by means of reciprocal compulsion. Furthermore, it's also important to note that the competition among workers is, in Marx's words, and I quote, "only another form of the competition among capitals," end of quote, because competition among workers divides workers and makes it easier to discipline them and lower their wages. So competition pits capitalists against each other, but it also unifies them by distributing the total surplus value surplus value among various branches and sectors of the ruling classes. And in that sense, competing capitalists act as, and this is a quote from Marx, hostile brothers who divide among themselves the loot of other people's labor. End of quote. And this unifying dynamic tells us something important about how the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of capitalist relations of production mediate each other. Competition is a class-transcending form of power, an abstract and impersonal form of domination which everyone is subjected to, but at the same time, it strengthens the class character of the power of capital because it unifies competing capitalists. So that was the relations of production, and now I will say something about the dynamics. And so far, I have presented a somewhat static picture of the capitalist mode of production. And in order to fully understand what mute compulsion is, we also need to take into account the dynamics of capitalist production. And one such dynamic is real subsumption, which in Marx's writing refers to capital's continuous remolding of the technical and organizational aspects of the labor process. Separated from the conditions of their reproduction, proletarians are forced to sell their labor power to capitalists. And after this act of exchange, the buyer takes command of the seller in the production process, and the anarchy of the market is replaced with the despotism of the workplace, as Marx often puts it. And the relationship between the capitalist or the representatives of the capitalist and the worker is not a result of a personal relation of dependence, but of a market transaction. Or as Marx puts it, the capitalist only holds power as the personification of capital. And competitive pressures force capitalists to use their power over workers to organize production in a manner that increases profitability as much as possible. And this is the driving force behind real subsumption. So subsumption is formal when capital takes over a labor process whose technical and organizational structure is a result of non-capitalist logics. And since such a labor process remains unchanged under formal subsumption, its capitalist form can easily be dissolved, according to Marx. This changes when subsumption becomes real, in distinction to formals. That is when capital begins to remold the social and technological structure of the labor process. And real subsumption can target all aspects of the production process: technologies, organizational structures, energy sources, divisions of labor, specialization, work rhythms, scales, systems of surveillance, work procedures, and so on. And it works by means of what is perhaps the most fundamental dynamic of capital's material restructuring of social reproduction. Separate in order to connect, fracture in order to reassemble, atomize in order to integrate. And this takes place on multiple levels of the capitalist totality. So life as such is separated from its condition in order to be reconnected in the production process. And social production is split into private and independent units of production in order to be reconnected by means of market transactions. And in a similar manner, capital seizes labor power by its roots within the production process and transforms labor power into, and transforms the potential to work, the labor power, into a potential whose condition of actualization is the mediation of valorizing value. So the valorization of value thus becomes a real condition of production, as Marx puts it. And in the 1861-63 manuscripts, Marx describes this dimension of capital's power by means of a useful distinction between the objective and the social conditions of labor, which corresponds to the double nature of production as a social and a natural process. So capital not only appropriates the objective conditions of labor, the means of production. Through real subsumption, it also appropriates the social conditions. So workers become one-sided, abstract, partial, disconnected, and isolated, to use Marx's words, with the consequence that their labor power becomes powerless when it stands alone. So the unification of these partial and disconnected workers takes place under the command of capital, which becomes, and I quote Marx here, and as indispensable as that a general should command on the field of battle, end of quote. Real subsumption is an effect of the power of capital in the sense that it's premised upon the power granted to capitalists by the relations of production. But the very exercise of this power tends to reproduce it. And for that reason, the capitalist production process is not only the production of commodities endowed with surplus value, it's at the same time a production of power. Marx only uses the concept of subsumption to refer to changes in the labor process. But as Andreas Malm has convincingly demonstrated, these categories can also throw light on capital's relationship with nature. Real subsumption of nature takes place when capital actively reorganizes natural processes in order to achieve its aims. And this can take on endlessly many forms and involve such processes as shifting to new forms of energy, selective breeding, various forms of biotechnological manipulation of plants and animals in order to increase yield and reduce turnover times, adjust natural processes to the abstract temporality of capital, and generally calibrate the rhythm of nature to capital's machinery. Some of the most extreme examples of this real subsumption of nature can be found in the epoch-making transformation of agriculture in the 20th century, where artificial fertilizer, pesticides, growth hormones, antibiotics, and hybrid seeds have revolutionized agricultural production. And this real subsumption of nature not only has catastrophic ecological consequences, it also tends to fortify the power of capital for exactly the same reason that the real subsumption of labor strengthens that very same form of power. It reorganizes the material conditions of production in a manner that gradually turns the valorization of value into a condition of social reproduction. A similar process of material restructuring takes place in the geography of production. That is, when capital actively reorganizes the spatial relations between producers in order to achieve its aims. Real subsumption takes place not only within individual production processes, but also between the different moments of the productive totality. For capital, spatial flexibility and increasing mobility are a source of power, and accordingly we should follow Marx and understand means of transportation and communication as weapons. The constant pressure to develop new and improved means of transportation and communication has been an integral part of the capitalist mode of production from its very beginning. But the so-called logistics revolution in the second half of the 20th century made it particularly clear just how much capital is able to reorganize the global geography of production by means of canals, ports, highways, railways, containers, supply chains, containers, trucks, and trains and ships, and so on. Capital has shrouded the planet in a web of supply chains, thereby making it possible to relocate and adapt, if anything, such as rebellious proletarians or foot-dragging governments or nature get in the way of profitability. So in that sense, logistics is an apparatus for carving the logic of capital into the crust of the earth. And it allows capital to supplement its appropriation of the objective and the social conditions of labor with the appropriation of the spatial or geographical conditions. And this, I would argue, amounts to a kind of real subsumption, yet on the level of the global totality rather than the level of the workplace. Real subsumption in all of its different forms of labor, nature, and the geography of production reveals a peculiar feature of the power of capital, because these dynamics are the result of the mute compulsion set in motion by the underlying capitalist relations of production. At the same time, however, they also strengthen this very same power and are thus also one of its sources, which means that the power of capital exhibits a paradoxical circularity. It's in the sense that it's partly the result of its own exercise. Real subsumption is a more or less constant dynamic, which might be stronger in periods with rising proletarian militancy or intense competition, but which is always there. But capitalist relations of production also set in motion a number of dynamics which exhibit a different pattern. For example, the reproduction of a relative surplus population and economic crises. In contrast to the dynamics of real subsumption, the creation of a surplus population and crises, both of these tendencies follow a cyclical pattern, and they are similar to real subsumption, however, in the sense that they are simultaneously results and sources of the impersonal and abstract power of capital. So let me say a bit about surplus populations and crises. Much has been written about the validity of Marx's theory of the general law of capital accumulation, and I will not go into details with this here. In my view, Marx convincingly argues that capitalism necessarily tends to generate a certain level of unemployment, and that the creation and reproduction of a relative surplus population increases the power of capital, first of all, by intensifying competition among workers. And I think something similar can be said about crises. Marx's analysis of the 1848 revolutions in Europe led him and Engels to believe that, and this is a quote from an article they wrote in 1850, that a new revolution is possible only in the consequence of a new crisis. So in the following years, end of quote, and in the following years, Marx constantly looked for signs of the coming crisis and anticipated it several times. And he and Engels were euphoric when the global financial crisis of 1857 broke out. But they were also soon disappointed, and this disappointment led Marx to rethink the relationship between crises and the power of capital. Put briefly, Marx moved from a conception of crisis as a crisis of the power of capital to an understanding of crisis as a part of the power of capital. And in this view, a crisis is, and I quote Marx, a necessary violent means for the cure of the plethora of capital, end of quote. So it's a mechanism by which of means capital avoids breakdown. Crises tend to intensify the pressure of competition and leads to what Marx calls the violent annihilation of capital, not by circumstances external to it, but rather as a condition of its self-preservation. Those capitalists that survive the crisis are often able to buy means of production from downsized or bankrupted companies at a bargain price, which means that they are able to lower the value composition of capital and increase the rate of profit. The annihilation of capital is especially hard on branches where overproduction is particularly acute, and for this reason, crises also tend to reduce disproportionality. And in addition to that, a crisis also intensifies competition among workers, which often leads to lower wages and makes it easier to discipline workers. So by means of such mechanisms, a crisis prepares the way for a new round of accumulation. And in that sense, we could say that a crisis is capital's attempt to flee its own shadow, to survive by internalizing its own partial negation, and a situation where it sacrifices a part of itself in order to let the valorization of value continue. So at the end here, I want to say a bit about what it means to describe these mechanisms of domination as impersonal and abstract. The relations and dynamics I have discussed demonstrate that the logic of valorization forces itself upon society by means of an abstract impersonal form of power, which cannot be grasped through the categories of violence and ideology. But precisely what does it mean to say that these forms of power are abstract and impersonal? The economic power of capital is impersonal in several different senses. First, in the sense that it's the power of a social logic rather than the power of a person or a group of persons. Secondly, it's impersonal in the sense that proletarians are not subjected to a particular personification of this social logic. Third, it is impersonal in the sense that in some of its expressions, such as the movement of prices on the market, its exercise cannot be attributed to a particular person. Finally, it is also impersonal in the sense that, properly speaking, it does not address persons, but rather their environment. And the economic power of capital is abstract in two different senses. First, in the sense that capitalist society is ruled by the obscure metamorphoses and movements of real abstractions. Second, it's abstract in the sense that it's often difficult or even impossible to identify its expressions as an exercise of power and to locate it in time and space. Think of a military intervention or a lynching or a police raid, which are all tangible and concrete exercises of power, which are experienced as such and can be located in time and space. In contrast to, for example, how decreasing shipping costs or cheap fertilizers increase the international division of labor in a manner that entangles the agriculture of an entire region or country more tightly in global webs of value. Okay, I think I've talked for 40 minutes now. So, okay, I have 2 minutes left or something like that. Okay, so the distinction between ideological, violent, and economic power raises the question of the precise relationship between these three forms of power. And I think that the first thing to say about this is that they are irreducible to each other, as they spring from three distinct capacities. A second thing to say is that although it's possible to distinguish quite clearly, conceptually, between these forms of power, it's also important to note that in reality, they are completely entangled in each other in many different ways. So consider, for example, how the reproduction of a relative surplus population and the competition it generates among workers provide a fertile ground for racist ideology and racist violence, which in turn helps to reproduce capitalist relations of production by undermining collective proletarian action, a dynamic which I think is very much at play in contemporary Europe and in the US. Or consider how the generalization of the commodity form creates the basis of the bourgeois ideology of the market as a neutral mechanism of coordination between free economic actors. Both are examples of how economic and ideological power mutually reinforce each other. The third thing I want to emphasize is that all these three forms of power are equally necessary. I think that Marxists such as Gramsci or Althusser and other theorists of ideology have, to my mind, convincingly argued that capitalism could not exist without the support of ideological domination. And I also think that Marxist state theorists, particularly those who contributed to the state derivation debate in the 1970s, have similarly demonstrated that capitalist production presupposes a social institution endowed with the possibility of using violence in order to guarantee the general conditions of production. So my point with this book is not to say that violence and ideology are not important or that we should start focusing on these forms of power or anything like that. And I'm not trying to downplay the role of violence and ideology in the reproduction of capitalism. I'm simply saying that in addition to violence and ideology, there's also a third form of power, and that we need to understand this if we want to understand the persistence of the capitalist mode of production. So the absence of violence and ideology is not a sign of the absence of domination, but merely of a change in its form. I think I will end there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Søren. Are there right now any questions concerning mentioned terms or the mentioned concepts? So please feel free to answer to question Søren directly, and you may do your. You may be online to introduce just your surname, and then you can ask him right now. But I see that there's already a question. I'm reading it. I'm in the library and I have a question which unfortunately cannot turn on my mic and speak. Question. Reproduction of capitalism pertains to both the self-perpetuating form of reproduction and the non-economic conditions of reproduction. Marx abstracts from the letter. Don't you think that if we want to make sense of incorporate the non or extra economic conditions of reproduction requires a category transformation of the category of reproduction itself? To put it in another way, what critical reconstructions or problematizations your work engender in Marxist critique of political economy?
Wow, I think that's a good question. Let me just think about it for a second and read it again.
All right.
The non-economic conditions of reproduction. Processes and institutions such as racism, patriarchy, and the state are subordinated to the requirement of accumulation. I'm not sure I understand the question. What critical reconstructions or problematizations your work engender in Marx's critique of political economy? Well, I think that I'm not sure I have understood the question correctly, but there's a lot of throughout my book I discuss a lot of things and claims in Marx's work which I think are wrong. So it's important for me to stress that Marx was a thinker in constant development, and he changed a lot of he changed his opinions about a lot of things throughout his throughout the years, and so it's he often disagrees with himself. But I also I disagree with a lot of what Marx says, and I think there are a lot of problems in many of his writings. But often he also disagrees with himself on these points. But I also disagree with Marx on some points where I don't think that he changed his mind in his later works. For example, in his theory of crisis and in his theory of surplus populations. But more generally, I think that in a certain sense, I think that Marx's research project, his critique of political economy, was wanted to do too much in a sense. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why he didn't manage to finish it, is that it was simply, in a sense, too ambitious. But in another sense, I also think it's obvious that he had some blind spots, and that he didn't include it, and that it wasn't large enough in that sense, that it didn't include enough. I think one of the most damaging blind spots of his theory is his failure to work out a comprehensive analysis of the reproduction of labor power. And I think that the Marxist feminist tradition have shown very convincingly that in order to understand the capitalist mode of production, it's extremely important to understand the reproduction of labor power and the relationship between and this uniquely capitalist split between the reproduction of labor power and the production of commodities. And I think this is one of the and perhaps that is one of the aspects of this question that we should enlarge in the concept of reproduction in that way. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was an answer, but
thank you very much.
It's a bit difficult for me to read the chat at the same time as
so I will read it for you.
But I don't really have an overview of what goes on in the chat.
There's one. So can we expect 2 more books by you, Søren? One of the state and one on ideology? Do you want to comment on that one?
Well, no, I don't think so. I hope you can expect more books from me, but I'm not planning to write a book about the state or ideology. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm not going to do that is that I think that there's so much good literature on the state and ideology already, and that's not to say that there isn't a lot of good literature about mute compulsion or economic power, because as I mentioned, there are a lot of Marxist thinkers who have written great stuff about this, and I really like the work of scholars such as Michael Heinrich and Ellen Meixens-Wood, for example. I think they have written some great things about the abstract and impersonal power of capital, but I couldn't. And of course, Moshe Postone also. I think he's probably the only one who has written a book about which attempts to build a theory of this, because. But I still felt like there was something missing in that literature. But I don't feel that way about the literature on the state and ideology. But so I'm currently working on a research project about Marxism and the body, and I hope that that will result at some point in a book about that, about Marxism and the body, and it actually builds a lot on some of the things I also write about in the first part of the book, which I didn't talk about today. Well, I think that what I attempt to do in that section of the book is to provide an answer to the question of why is such a thing as economic power even possible. And I think that what I argue is that human beings have a unique relationship to the rest of nature because the human being is biologically underdetermined. That's an expression I take from the philosopher Kate Soper and her work, and that has to do with and in that section I draw a lot on Marx's analysis of human use of tools, and this idea that the use of tools is something that is unique about human beings, not because humans are the only animals that use tools, and I think that Marx is also explicit about that, but because human tool use are much more important for the human relationship to the rest of nature than in other animals, and human tools are much more complex in a sense. Well, there's a long line of arguments, but why is it? Well, in some sense, I would say that it's not necessary for the analysis of forms of power in capitalism. I mean, it's not necessary to answer the question of why is it possible? What is it about human beings that makes this possible at all? It's not necessary to answer that question for analyzing capitalist forms of power. I just think that it provides a fuller picture of what this form of power is, and I think it helps to understand what it means that economic power is a form of power that is rooted in the capacity to reorganize the material environment of the subject. So I think it helps us understand what it is, and that's the reason why I found it interesting to include that in the book. Yeah.
Thank you. There were two more questions in the chat. I will read one. I just wanted to say, isn't the idea of economic compulsion or economic power not the same as Slavoj Žižek's understanding of what he calls objective violence? If not, how does it differ?
Thank you for that question. It's been a while since I read Žižek's book, Violence, so I'm not sure I can remember what exactly what he means by that. But I think that there are at least a substantial overlap between those concepts. Yes, and I am also aware that I mean, I know that some people will criticize my notion of violence for being too narrow. I mean, it's quite common to. Some people would prefer to talk also of ideological violence, for example, or structural violence, and or as Žižek, objective and subjective violence. So I'm aware that that I. Instead of just making a distinction between ideological power, violent power or coercive power, and economic power, I could have used another terminology and distinguished between different forms of violence, for example, but yeah, I think that what Žižek calls objective violence is at least very similar to some of the things I describe as economic power or mute compulsion. Yeah.
Thank you. One question concerning the entanglement of compulsion, ideology, and violence. Maybe you could talk about examples for that.
Well, I think that I think I mentioned some examples in my talk. I think, for example, if we accept the idea that the creation of a relative surplus population can be seen as a mechanism of domination, a mechanism of economic power, then we could. It's interesting that throughout the history of capitalism, there has often been the generation of a relative surplus population has often functioned as the basis for, or as I described it, as a fertile ground for racism. Marx analyzed an example of this in his discussion of racism towards the Irish among English working classes in the 1850s. So that's an example of how racist ideology and racist violence builds upon mechanisms of economic power, but there are many other examples also, and one very important thing is the state. I think most Marxists would agree that the state's capacity to employ violence in order to enforce property rights, for example, is a necessary component in a necessity in a capitalist system, which means that violence is always in the background in a sense. And that's, you can find this idea in Marx's writings also, that under normal circumstances the mute compulsion might do the job, but in exceptional circumstances the violence, the state must step in with violence in order to ensure the reproduction of capitalism. So yeah, that was just.
Thank you. There are two questions concerning the reception of your book in Denmark, and it was also on my list. So we all know that it was received. You had some talks even at the TV. So could you please tell us more about it, especially by the political right?
Yes. Well, the Danish edition of the book came out in almost, I think it's 2 months ago, in September, and it has. I have been very surprised to see how much discussion it has generated. So there's been a lot of discussions about the book in Danish media and Danish newspaper and television and radio, and there has also been a very aggressive reaction from right-wing intellectuals who it has been quite interesting to follow and to see how. One of the things that that I have found very interesting about the reaction from the right wing in Denmark to my book is that they are very reluctant to actually to defend capitalism. So their primary strategy has been to a classical Red Scare, Cold War style anti-communism, and to accuse me of being a Stalinist psycho, instead of actually trying to defend capitalism. So most of the reactions have been Red Scare tactics, and it's quite interesting for me to see how right-wing intellectuals seems to have almost, at least in Denmark, given up on trying to articulate a coherent defense of why the capitalist system is the best economic system. So that has been quite interesting, yeah. Well, I think that it's very much a conscious and planned process at the level of the individual individual capital or in individual company. I mean, of course, companies all the time think about how to increase productivity, how to lower costs, and how to win market shares from their competitors. But they are forced to do so constantly by the pressure of competition, at least in most branches, and of course to varying degrees. But so on a system level, on the level of the totality, there is nothing conscious about it at all, nothing planned about it. On the level of the totality, it's an outcome of the abstract dynamics of the market and of capitalist production, but this results in the pressure, this pressure results in and the necessity for a conscious real subsumption at the level of the individual company. Well, the reason why I speak of a relative surplus population is that, you know, no one is a surplus in any absolute sense. I mean, the reason why I talk of relative surplus population is because Marx talks of relative surplus population, and the relative means relative to capital's need. So it's always a surplus population in relation to what capital needs, and that's why. And I think that's quite important to insist on that. That the only way it makes sense to speak about people as surplus population is in relationship to the demands of capital. So.
I got a question. It's a more political one, if you like. What does your book mean when you take a look at political organizations like, I don't know, political parties, left parties, or the radical left, or whatever? I mean, do you see any potential to escape this situation? What do you think? What are your thoughts about it?
Thank you for that question. Well, I've been thinking a lot about whether or not a book like this, like such a theoretical book, should have any political consequences, immediate political consequences, and whether and what those consequences would be. And I think that my conclusion is that we should, well, of course, as Marxists, we know that books are not what is going to change the world, and theories and thoughts, and it's not like we can use a book to use arguments to change people's minds and then change the world in that way. So that raises the question of what can we use books and theories and concepts for then? And I think that we should be very careful not to expect that abstract theory can provide us with with answers to tactical and strategic political questions in the immediate situation. I think that we should what a book like this can do, hopefully, is to develop concepts that can be used to produce concrete analyses of concrete situations, which can be meaningful for political movements. So a part of, so it's always important for political movements, always, social movement, political movement, parties, etc., always rely on certain conceptions and analyses of the situation they find themselves in. And hopefully theory can help to create concepts that are useful for making those immediately strategic relevant analyses, but cannot in itself provide strategic guidance. And I think that may sound like giving up or depoliticizing theory or something like that, but I think that my point is more that Marxist scholars should be careful not to think that what they are doing when they're writing books is the politically essential, is what is going to change things. So yeah, Was that an answer to your question?
Yeah, I think my thinking is the same. I mean, you need to be careful not to get a depression when you really get into all the analysis of the real world, of all the capitalistic problems. And yeah, I'm on your side. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. And yeah, so I don't know. I mean, maybe you could elaborate about the political sphere or the political nature in Denmark. I mean, are there any good left movements there? And because in Germany, for example, we almost never hear about Denmark. We don't know what's going on there. So, what are your yeah?
Well, one thing I can mention is that there's like local elections, municipal elections. Is that perhaps the term?
I think it's a good term.
Coming up next week in Denmark, and it seems that the largest left-wing party, the Red-Green Alliance, it looks like they will have a lot of success in those elections, which is quite interesting because sometimes winning elections on the local level can be, in a sense, much more meaningful and lead to a lot of changes compared to on a national level in the general elections. But at the same time, there would also be a lot of critics on the left in Denmark, which would argue that the Red-Green Alliance has paid that the price that the party has paid in order to be so popular as it is now has been too big. And I would probably agree with some of those critics, at least in some of the critique. But yeah, but that's where a lot of the attention is, that a lot of the discussions and attention is right now in Denmark.
I don't see any other questions right now, and so there's nothing left but to say thank you very much, Søren, to give an insight into your book. For me, actually, it was really the best book I read in the last 2 years or so. So it was really a pleasure, and it was really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for all the questions. And thank you very much for your presentation and your time. So I wish us all a good day, a good night, wherever you are. Take care, and let's see how it will works out. It's the next week in Copenhagen and otherwhere in Denmark, and who will win the election. So bye bye.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming.